We're going to give everybody a couple minutes before we go ahead and get started. So people are still trickling in. All right, take about 15 more seconds and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Hello and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the second honoring diversity lecture taking place this spring semester. I am Damian Clement, Associate Dean of WVU's Honors College, and tonight's lecture is entitled Overlooked Forms of Racism at Predominantly White Institution by Dr. Rachael Purtell. Dr. Purtell is a 2023 graduate of West Virginia University with a PhD in Communication Studies. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening. After the presentation, we will host an open question and answer session. Since we're using the Zoom webinar platform for this lecture, before we begin, let me review some of the features that will help you experience this evening's lecture in the best way possible. If you're having issues with your audio or video at any point during the webinar, be sure to check your personal Zoom settings and your computer's volume control. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see others' questions, only their own. To ask a question, you must click on the Q&A button. A separate screen will appear. Then you may type your question. The presenter will answer all questions live at the end of the presentation. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. Now, let's get started with this evening's lecture. So it is my privilege and pleasure to hand the floor over to Dr. Purtell. And Rachel, I didn't ask you if I was pronouncing your name correctly, so I apologize if I butchered it in any way.
No worries, you were close. It's Purtell, but
Okay.
close enough for me. So I'll go
you.
ahead and share my screen. It'll just take me a couple minutes to get it set up properly so I can view my own speaker notes. But you all will see. Okay, Dr. Clement, can you confirm that you can see the slides, but not
yes,
my...
I can see. You are good to go.
Okay, is that still the case?
Yes.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Rachael Purtell. And as already mentioned, I did complete my PhD at West Virginia University in the Department of Communication Studies in May. I'm still in higher education and more of an administrative role, and I'm also working with an emergent nonprofit organization and helping out with their communications and development. One major area of my research focus is on communication experiences tied to racism, prejudice, and discrimination within organizational context. And I'm here to talk to you all today about some overlooked forms of racism at predominantly white institutions. I do want to note that this is not an exhaustive or comprehensive presentation, as there are many, many forms and faces of racism. But today we're going to focus primarily on a couple of different forms of racism that tend to be perpetuated by those who outwardly identify as liberal, progressive, feminist, etc., but still promote harmful ideologies in more covert ways, particularly within academic spaces. Before we get into the meat of this, though, I did want to take a moment and make some very important acknowledgments. First, I want to thank WVU's Honors College for allowing me to be here today to start this very important conversation, and also to thank Marla Gladstone for spearheading the first Honoring Diversity series last year. There are a lot of really great presentations and important topics last year and also coming up again this year. And I'm very flattered and honored to have been invited back to such a needed program at WVU. I also want to acknowledge these great scholars whose work informed this presentation. It's very important to me that you all know that I did not put forth the original ideas and research that I want to share with you today. Rather, I have just been given this opportunity to share the information and present it in a way that I think would be relevant to our purposes and mission here at this event at WVU today. I will also provide a full list of references and further reading at the end of this presentation. I also want to take a moment and acknowledge the indigenous lands that we are currently unwelcome settlers on, and note that the colonization of indigenous peoples is ongoing. WVU, we are currently occupying the following: the Satsoyola, land of the Sunfire people, home of the Yuchi tribe; Shawandasi Tula, land of the Southwind Earth, home to the Shawanawaki and Shawnee tribes, formerly the Calicut tribes. But the information that I was able to obtain about the indigenous lands that we're on was a little unclear and lacked pronunciation guide. So I do want to pause for a brief moment if anyone wants to drop any corrections or additions to these land acknowledgements in the chat. Okay, great. I don't see anything, so we'll move on. I would also like to acknowledge my own privilege and positionality as a cisgender white woman in academia, especially the field of communication studies. When we talk about systems of oppression like racism, it's important for us to also consider the context in which these conversations occur, especially with academia being the focus of this presentation. I am in a field where my perspective is well represented and valued, and that is something that's important for you all to consider as we head into this discussion today. I'm not immune to committing some of these forms of racism that we're going to discuss just because I recognize them and have read about them. And me sitting here leading this discussion today is an example of my privilege as a dominant group member in society, academia, and my discipline. So you should be critical of how I perform here today. So I invite and embrace that criticism of how I handle these topics, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation if anyone wants to reach out to me outside of this discussion, but we will have time for questions and commentary at the end. And finally, we talk a lot about safe spaces for discussions like this in academia, but as you will see in the ensuing discussion, academia is often not a safe space for these conversations. So I challenge those in attendance to really consider what is usually meant by a safe space and whose safety is actually prioritized. Typically, we come at these race and racism related topics in a way that is to support the comfortability of white people, whether we realize that or not. So I hope that instead today we can co-construct a courageous space where we can challenge these harmful norms and a humble space for self-reflection in the next hour. For those of you sharing similar positionality to me, you may feel uncomfortable at various points in this conversation, and you probably should, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, discomfort can be a signal to us that maybe more work is needed to be done in a certain area, and that there will always be more work to do, and there's always new insights to glean from conversations like this. And there's also always ways to handle these conversations better. So let's use this knowledge together to become better educators, scholars, and leaders. So first, I want you to take a moment and just silently reflect on what types of people typically come to mind when we think about racists. So in other words, who are racists? You may have thought of people like this: right-wing, conservative, stereotypically uneducated, or working class racial bigots. So people who engage in outward, overt, obvious forms of racial derogation and intentional acts of discrimination. You may not have thought about people who proudly identify as liberal, leftist, or a Democrat. You may not have thought about highly educated progressives, leaders of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or those who proudly posted Black squares and hashtag Black Lives Matter during the summer of 2020. However, we all have internalized superiority associated with our dominant group memberships, and whether unwittingly or not, we inevitably display racist and or oppressive attitudes and behaviors. So when we stereotype only certain groups of people as committing these acts of racism, what we're ultimately doing is we're trying to juxtapose ourselves against bad whites and construct this binary perception of people as either racist or not racist, rather than viewing it as a system that people enact to maintain the status quo. So when those of us who identify as liberal, progressive, etc., when we place ourselves in morally superior positions to people like the individuals in these photos, we fail to deal with our own prejudice and instead engage in a virtue signaling facade that we care about racism without actually taking action that would significantly alter the racial and economic status quo that privileges us. So when people of color do give voice to the discrimination that they experience in liberal spaces like academic institutions, they're often silenced by their colleagues, many of whom claim to be liberal progressives. So there's a couple different consequences that come out of this and a couple different forms of liberal racism that I want to go over right now. And the first is the invisible labor clause. And this refers to the added invisible labor that marginalized groups are required to perform in order to successfully navigate their daily existence within social and professional spaces. This can come in the form of someone self-censoring themselves or just otherwise assimilating to white professional norms. Similarly, the inclusion tax refers to the extra resources spent by people of color just to adhere to these norms in white spaces. So this can include tangible things like time and money, but also includes emotional and cognitive energy as well. And all of this labor and spent resources contributes to the silencing of people of color in white institutional spaces. Some common examples of this in academic institutions include the added burden that faculty of color face when teaching their courses, and also taking on disproportionate level of mentoring students of color. People of color are also often pressured to conform and manage their emotions to suit the comfort of white people, often, again, as a means of professional survival day to day. Faculty of color may feel pressure to remain silent about injustice or inequalities they face in their workplace until they are tenured or promoted. And those that do face hostility in departments tend to withdraw from department functions or resign or take leaves of absences, etc. And then when that happens, in turn, white colleagues may resort to criticizing these faculty members for not being engaged or not interacting with them. And these things can have very real consequences on things like tenure and promotion. So it's not just social suffering that these people that experience these things are going through. So all of these everyday interactions really add up to an exhausting burden for people of color. We also, in academic spaces, a lot of the time we'll see what's known as racism evasiveness or race evasive rhetoric. And this is a language and communication that denies naming and addressing the significant realities of racism. So refusing to see it or strategically downplaying the role that race is playing in a situation. And racism evasiveness also interacts with external racial ideologies of colorblindness or liberal informed colorblind ideology. This refers to a belief system that rests on seemingly surface level positive and humanist notions that people do not and should not see or make judgments about differences in skin color. Again, on the surface, that sounds somewhat positive, but in practice, it really just muddies the water and shields reality of what is going on. Some common behaviors where this is often displayed include emotional responses. White women's tears would be an example that function to deflect from hard conversations and get ourselves out of conversations that we're uncomfortable with as white people. It may also manifest in using African Americans as color capital to show that we are sophisticated, progressive, and cool enough to have Black friends. I might send my white children to racially diverse schools as a way to deflect from my own problematic or racist behavior. There's also something known as race-conscious racism, where a white person will say something racist and then blame it on the implicit bias. White people may also claim special insights due to traveling the world or having an interracial partner. So all of these things, all of these examples tend to surface in conversations about racism and lead to liberal white supremacy. We've already talked about two of these, the first and the last on the bottom half of this image here, and we'll get into white fragile behaviors in a minute. But in addition to vilifying, quote unquote, racist, we also vilify those who are most outspoken about race and racism. So all of these things combine and inform what is globally known as liberal white supremacy, or the tendency of white people to constantly place themselves in a superior moral position. Again, we've talked about practices already so far that uphold it, but it does take many forms. Some additional ones that you might see are, white people competing for the title of most woke progressive, a white person inserting themselves into conversations about racial and economic inequality, but only when it becomes popular or high profile to do so. So in academic institutions, white liberal faculty work, knowingly or not, to shift the intellectual discourse back to their white voices, making them seem, again, morally superior. And often individuals and organizations who do publicly align themselves with those who are vocal on issues pertaining to race and racism tend to be marginalized, taking a strong stance on issues of racial justice and equity, calling out racist practice, or identifying ways that an institution participates in maintaining the status quo is generally frowned upon. So therefore, the individuals who do engage in this political work in institutions often find themselves in difficult positions. One really relevant manifestation of some of these more liberal, subtle forms of racism that we have all likely witnessed in higher education, whether we were aware of it or not at the time, is the tendency for white students and academics in discussions about race is for these white students and faculty to depict them as arenas of violence. So this goes back to the idea that I talked about in the acknowledgement section, that the goal of safety in these intellectual discussions has been sort of appropriated in a way that is actually typically driven by white participants who will complain that they are or fear they will be attacked during these discussions. A phenomenon that D'Angelo and Senso term discursive violence. So this is yet another mechanism that white people use to inhibit people of color from speaking about race and racism in academic spaces, and to ultimately reinforce and protect white supremacy. And there are tactics too in this setting, like something that's known as the right to my opinion discourse, which essentially communicates, I have the right to think and say what I want, and you don't have the right to challenge what I think and say. But I'm choosing to focus specifically on discourses of violence because I think this is very prevalent in academic spaces, and it's very dangerous in that what discourses of violence function to do is they position whites as racially innocent. So when we engage in a discourse of violence in a conversation about race and racism, I, as a white person, am painting myself as racially open, unknowing, and willing to learn. So like tabula rasa, right? But if I don't know anything about racism, how could then I be held accountable for my investments in and enactments of it? But yeah, as we already talked about, there are so many forms of racism that we enact throughout our lives, whether knowingly or not, so implicitly and explicitly. Scholars like bell hooks have also noted that white people who, think of themselves as the least racist people, they often become the most angry when they're confronted about their whiteness or their white privilege. So when we position ourselves as white people as unknowing and unaware of racism and how we participate in it or how others perpetuate it, it allows us to ignore the impact of racism on people of color while still enjoying its benefits as a white person. These discourses also position people of color as the perpetrators of violence. statements that do this in these kinds of conversations are when white people express that they felt that they have been wronged in the discussion somehow, or use language about fear and safety. Like, I feel unsafe in this discussion. I feel unsafe in my interactions with this person or in this space. So a lot of really intense language that's construing an environment is repressive to white people. And this language of victimization and abuse, it not only allows white people to demand more social resources be channeled in their direction to support them, but it also reinforces dominant discourse, which paints people of color as inherently dangerous. So it reinforces things like stereotypes of criminality in Black men, the yellow peril stereotype among Asians, things like that. It also trivializes the history of extensive, brutal, and explicit physical violence perpetrated by whites against people of color. So just to name a few, in the US, slavery, lynching, whipping, genocide, internment, forced sterilization, medical experimentation, just a couple, as well as its ideological rationalizations. So it really, when we suggest that people of color are irrational, aggressive, or threatening in these discussions, it really obscures the power and privilege that comes with whiteness. And finally, it also maintains white solidarity, as problematic statements about race and racism by white people go unchecked or even supported. Often in these discussions, white people have tacit agreements to support each other, and it can be a site of white racial bonding, unfortunately. In classroom discussions about race, for example, white solidarity might manifest through explicit support of other whites' claims of victimization, or just implicit consent conveyed through white silence and the absence of social censure. So as whites, we'll position ourselves as brave and vulnerable in these discussions about race. We'll praise each other for taking risks, while the risks that people who actually name racism, especially when they're people of color, and its effects on their lives, are completely dismissed. So many scholars of race have really called upon white women in particular to engage in critical self-reflection, and have noted that when we only focus on gender inequality and fail to see our racial privilege, we become more sensitive to criticism and conversations about race, and deal poorly with feelings of shame and guilt. And our preoccupation with gender inequality alone has been evidenced throughout history. Of the major feminist movements, a repeated criticism that we face is that we're really only focused on white women's rights. And all the while, we also have, people like Carolyn Bryant, who lied about Emmett Till flirting, touching, whistling at her. And as a result, this young man was beat, mutilated, shot in the head, his body sunk over. If you look at the picture on the top right of protesters at Little Rock when schools were desegregated, the people in the background are white women. The people who threw rocks at bridges were white women. You also had organizations like the Women's KKK. This was considered a feminist organization at the time of its inception. It was something that, progressive liberal women joined, and it was something that, they were, happy and proud to be a part of. And let's not also forget that white married women also owned and abused their slaves as well. And then today we have people like Starbucks manager Holly Hilton and Amy Cooper wrongfully calling the police on Black men rightfully occupying public spaces for purposes like going to the bathroom and bird watching. Also more recently was the City Bike Karen incident. And police encounters for people of color are highly dangerous and often fatal. And Amy Cooper in particular displayed explicit knowledge of this when she said, "I'm going to tell them that there is an African-American man threatening my life." So these women use their social positionality to put these men in danger in these cases. So when we often depict cis, straight, white men as the problem for all of these systems of repression, but white women are not racially innocent. either. And being feminist alone does not absolve from racism. And in fact, feminism in and of itself can be warped and appropriated into something much more sinister, which we call toxic white feminism. And this refers to microaggressions where the intersection of race and gender conversations include things like tone policing. So wanting people of color to stop being aggressive or angry. So we might describe someone as intense or dominant, or ask them to censor themselves in conversations. We also see what's known as spiritual bypassing. So this is language by which we demand peace from communities in peril. And this can manifest in language like all lives matter, or in discourse of violence situations, we might hear someone say, a faculty member say, white students deserve to feel safe in these conversations too. There's also what's known as the white savior complex. So this is when we focus on only what we have done for people of color in the past. So presenting a list of our good deeds and everything that we've done to be a good ally, talking about, previous efforts that we have engaged in or events that we've held that weren't attended or weren't recognized or something. We also have centering. So this is focusing only on one's own emotions and sensitivity. So again, redirecting the conversation. What about women's rights? What about class? And then also, again, white women's tears. So it shifts the focus from people of color to white women in need of care. We also might call that white fragility. So the use of any of these strategies really deflects difficult dialogues between women of color and white women, which if pursued could lead to genuine insight and potential coalition building. But this white woman as the victim trope can only hold if women of color and their experiences under white supremacy are rendered invisible or ignored. And if we as white women don't hold ourselves and other white women accountable for our role in the reproduction of and our benefit from white supremacy, we're just going to keep repeating the problem. There is ample documentation that white feminism has been called out repeatedly by women of color for its racist and exclusionary politics. But we aren't able to find quite as much documentation of white feminism calling out white women even when social and political events mandate that we do so. So, not the feel-good talk of the year, but I do want to end with some strategies to move forward before we get into the question and answer portion of our webinar today. And first and foremost, you have to listen to people. White liberals who do claim that they care about unlearning racism, we shouldn't react immediately with disbelief when a person of color shares their experiences. Resist the urge to deny racism people of color experience that by claiming that it was due to something else. Perhaps they were discriminated against because of sexism, not racism, or because they look young or were not dressed appropriately, didn't present themselves appropriately, and so forth. The research that we have shows that people of color are very good at reading the situation when they experience discrimination, and they have likely already analyzed and ruled out all other possibilities for the mistreatment other than racism. So if they're raising the issue, they've thought about every other possible explanation, however many times. Similarly, for white people that are really ready to engage in genuine alliances with people of color, they're not leading with presenting a list of their good deeds. They're not really interested in convincing themselves or others that they're anti-racist. They understand that this kind of work involves a lifetime commitment and constant self-reflection. In other words, if you want to be an ally, you don't get to claim that title yourself. You wake up and you earn it every damn day. So a list of good deeds will be unnecessary for genuine allies because you show your allyship through action. Which brings us very nicely to strategy number 2, show up. So this can be demonstrated in ways that do not only involve one's physical presence at marches, it also means supporting radical activists, even when it becomes unpopular or uncomfortable to do so. Again, true allies show up in the moment when the publicity is not there. They show up to support radical people of color and help center their stories rather than taking the opportunity to showcase their own activities. They show up by protecting colleagues, especially people of color who are brave enough to identify and address racist behaviors and practices in their organizations. Focusing on the academic side of things, academic department leaders are often aware of who the toxic people are in their departments, but they choose to ignore them. People of color need more than just recognition that someone is problematic or that they have been or are being targeted. They need action. What scholars of race often recommend or would like to see from leaders in these moments is immediate confrontation of the racist toxic behavior. Much like we do in our classrooms, when a student is giggling or having a side conversation with a friend because they do not like something that someone else has said, good professors will call them out and will address that immediately in the moment. And if the problematic behavior continues, call this person into a meeting and let them know that their behavior is unprofessional. So that way we remove some of the burden from faculty of color who are likely, again, exerting a substantial amount of energy managing those behaviors for their own survival. Another way to show up is to adopt an action-oriented and racism-centered intersectional approach to social justice. Racism evasive approaches limit organizational goals and prevent activists from effectively challenging the racist practices of their opponents. So an action-oriented, racism-centered intersectional approach rejects the additive perspective, which results in privileging gender or class over other forms of repression. And on the other side, that non-racism centered approaches to intersectionality recenter white women in the case of gender or white men in the case of class. So a racism centered intersectional approach really walks the walk and talks the talk in a way that gives space to marginalized voices and instead of recentering white voices as morally superior. And again, I just want to reiterate, use confrontational tactics to address incidents of racism. Confrontational doesn't mean aggressive. Confrontational doesn't mean violent, but it does mean explicit. So if we don't do this, we will inevitably perpetuate all of the problematic ideologies and discourse in academic spaces that we've already discussed today. And finally, strategy number 3, read. The burden of learning how to be an ally must ultimately fall on us who wish to be them. We have to put in the work, and there's plenty of scholarship out there on how even well-meaning white people perpetuate racism, which brings me to my references for this presentation. And I'm happy to send out this list to anyone who is interested. But now we can go ahead and you can answer questions. And Dr. Clement, if you want to jump in and tag team some of these with me as well, I would welcome.
Yes, definitely. Definitely we can do that. So very nice presentation. Thank you for sharing. Attendees, we have now opened up the floor for questions. We have the I believe it's the Q&A section, or is it the chat? It's one of them. Q&A section, Q&A button. What questions do we have for Dr. Purtell? Purtell, sorry.
It's okay. It's close. I still feel like Rachel, anyway.
I was going to say Rachel, but I wanted to acknowledge your PhD that you work so hard to.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Not a problem.
But yeah, I don't see any questions yet.
Not yet.
Savannah or Dr. Clement, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any questions just to get us started?
I'm always ready. Always ready. Savannah, you got something?
While I think of how to word it properly, go ahead, because I have
okay.
But it doesn't sound right yet. So
yeah. Okay, so
I understand.
You talked about all these different types of racism, and you also offered some guidance on how to address it. Is there anything in the literature that, and I know you have your references there and stuff like that, so can you use, can you give me an example from the literature about how to approach dealing with one of these forms of racism if we were to see them? Could you give me some literature
Yeah,
backing? I don't know if
yeah.
that's a, it's a,
So there's a great book. I did include it in my references. Let me go look
mhm,
at the title real quick just so I don't butcher it. But um, there's a book titled Liberal White Supremacy: How Progressives Silence Racial Class and Oppression. It's written by Angie Beeman.
mhm,
It just came out in 2022, so it's a fairly recent work. That it's a short read, but it's very in depth, and it does provide a lot more detail about some of the strategies I mentioned, like
mhm,
confrontational tactics and what taking a racism centered intersectional approach to social justice really means. I think, intersectionality has really become a buzzword
mhm,
the past few years, but I think we've lost sight of what Kimberly Crenshaw really meant when she first introduced the concept. Um, I think colloquially, we kind of look at it as just like the combination of social identities that we happen to have. For example, um, if I was someone who was both gay and a woman, we might think, like colloquially, we think of that as intersectionality, but it's
mhm,
really, that's oversimplifying it. You know, we can't really, the idea is that we can't really unravel one of these oppressive systems in our society. We have to take a holistic approach and dismantle them together because they're all interwoven together. Sexism, classism, racism, they're all interwoven. But the problem with that, though, is that we still have privilege as white people. So if we don't center race and racism, we allow other issues to overshadow them. And so we address the issues that affect us, but still maintain our status quo. Um, and again, I just think being explicit and knowing these terms is very helpful. Being able to call this out for what it is when we see it is helpful because these aren't behaviors that are, easily addressed by policy. They're not written into things like Title IX, for example. So just being able to identify these things will help us engage in some of those confrontational strategies by which we can hold people accountable.
okay. Savannah, I'll let you sit on your question there. We got a couple here. We come back to you. Can you share ways in which this work can be really hard and the process of learning, unlearning, and relearning from mistakes as they happen?
Yeah, I'm sure that's a great question. Of course, it's hard. My PhD wasn't fun. Like studying these topics is extremely emotionally draining. Writing about these topics is extremely emotionally draining. Um, but then I stop and think, I'm saying that as a white person, just reading and learning about these things, what is it like to actually experience some of these things? So I think that, you know, although it can be hard, we need to be like put our compassion forward, for the people that are actually experiencing these really hard things and have been experiencing them throughout history. And of course, we will make mistakes. We will blow it, this is very, very complex stuff. You cannot learn it overnight. And it's not enough to just simply care about these things, and these topics are also always evolving and changing as well. One thing that, I really invite people to be critical of me about that I did not address in this presentation is even just the term white fragility. There's been recent discourse emerging that even that term is problematic because it still like functions to paint us as like sort of innocent and well-meaning and just, these things that need to be handled with care rather than, perpetrators of violence. So,
Oh,
yeah, it's tough, and like it's a tough road to walk with yourself too, you know. It's like you'll never get there, you know, you'll never be an expert as a white person. You'll never learn all there is to learn. There will always be more, there will always be things that you don't know. And it's also, you cannot, there's no way to like sacrifice your privilege to walk among the truly marginalized, but we can leverage our privilege in ways that are appropriate for us to do so while elevating the voices of those most marginalized.
nice. All right, our second question here. Do you believe the ideology of liberalism itself reinforces these oppressive systems due to its inherent reactionary philosophy?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll do my best to give hopefully a satisfying answer. Um, I think whenever you have any binary, it's problematic. You know, we have an ideological binary in the United States between liberals and conservatives. And I don't know if it's liberalism that is like the problem with some of these things that we see with these more liberal forms of racism, but more the fact that the binary exists because it provides us with an excuse that our behavior is okay because we're not doing these things that we're attributing to people on the other side of that. So I think this binary perception as liberal or conservative, racist or not racist, is more deeply a problem than any one ideology. Hopefully that's a satisfying answer.
This is an interesting one here. As a former high school social studies teacher, the topic of racism in history is a very delicate topic to address. What would be your advice to a high school teacher as to how to approach this topic without crossing a line that could lead to possible adverse repercussions?
Be careful. First of all, great question. Yeah, I think one of the hardest lessons that I had to learn is you can't always give people the benefit of the doubt. You know, whether that's like your leadership or the organization as a whole. I have been in situations where I have challenged racist practices in departments that I have been a part of. And, you know, I think among like very young activists, you almost like want for some of these opportunities to like call something out or address something to happen because you feel like it's what you're waiting to do. You're wanting to make an impact. You're wanting to do something good. Um, and, you know, I think that we have this false hope that like once we raise this issue or bring something to the attention of the leadership, it's going to be like, oh, thank you so much. We had no idea. We need to look at this differently. But that is often not the case. You know, again, like people who are vocal about these issues it puts them in very difficult positions. They're often punished for it. You know, I've witnessed this and I've experienced it firsthand. And again, it's worse for people of color that do call out things like this. And I think education is a really tricky subject because it is within, you know, educational institutions where a lot of racism is taught. You know, a lot of our true history is really, you know, sort of buried or deemed inappropriate for young audiences. Um, so if you're going to implement any additional curriculum to address some of these things throughout history, I would definitely make sure you have like a trusted colleague in your corner that's aware of what you are doing. And hopefully that person also has some power influence within the organization. Because if you don't have someone that like kind of has your back, you're going to be in a much more vulnerable position. And that's why collective action is so important too, whether that's within educational spaces or outside of it. Because often one person isn't enough to force legitimate change.
Nice, thank you. Do you think there are any problems with cancel culture and people shown being racist and then unable to be seen as better in the public eye because they're no longer having a chance. They no longer have a chance.
I don't have a problem with cancel culture. I think we're long overdue for it. This is kind of the confrontational accountability, one form of confrontational accountability that I was kind of talking about. And these people who have a strong enough media presence to be canceled also are privileged enough to have PR teams and personal agents that can help them manage these situations and craft like a very convincing, well-rounded apology. And apologies are good. Like I said, we all make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've made horrible mistakes that I've never thought I would make in my life. And the first person holding us accountable should be ourselves, and the first step to accountability is apologizing and acknowledging what we've done was wrong. And there's actually a lot of great literature out there specifically on apologies and intercultural encounters, where someone has committed a microaggression or a more overt act of harassment and discrimination. Quality apologies include not only an admission of wrongdoing, but also acknowledgement of that you understand the impact it had on the victim, and also promises to repair the situation in some way or take action to prevent the situation from reoccurring. So if people that were canceled did all these things, they would be fine, So cancel culture is such a non-issue to me, because we know too much for it to really truly affect anyone that has these types of resources to fix it or genuinely wants to improve.
Savannah, you ready? Craft it.
I think so. Okay. So I know a lot of people can feel kind of overwhelmed and kind of like walking on eggshells when they're kind of put in a situation where they're not sure if they should react. So I think like the first step definitely is awareness of all of these issues and microaggressions and these kind of more sinister, sneaky, forms of racism. But if someone is in a situation where they're not entirely sure of, the intention behind someone, or if that is a microaggression, how would you say that they should react, if not in a like kind of confrontational manner, if they're not entirely sure about it? Because I feel like a lot of people get into these situations where they don't really know, and so they tend to not act at all.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great question. And unfortunately, there is no simple answer. Every situation is different. And for me, in the times that I participated in collective action, like it was easy for me to do so, or just otherwise being outspoken. It was easy for me to do so because I was in a privileged enough position where if I experienced consequences for doing so, they wouldn't be that detrimental. Like I don't have kids or family that I'm trying to support or anything like that. So if I get fired from my job because I chose to be an advocate, like that's not as big of an issue for me as someone who's taking care of 3 kids, whose wife, doesn't work or something like that. So I do think one's own personal safety and situation does need to be considered when you're deciding whether to advocate or not. You also want to consider the power relationships between yourself and the persons or entities that you are challenging, because that can lead to different types of consequences as well. But most importantly, you also want to consider, like, is the impact going to be a positive one for the person actually being victimized? I think we might have an idea of what the right thing to do in some of these situations are, even if we don't have the words to speak up necessarily, or the tools to do so effectively. We may know, okay, like I should say something, but I don't know what to do. But there are definitely situations where that is not the case. Sometimes speaking up as a white person, for example, can put a person of color who's already being victimized in more danger. So let me illustrate with an example from my own personal life. I participated in a collective action to draft a letter in support of a colleague who was experiencing racism in my department. We were sort of, and it's a very good example for the question you asked, because we were sort of naive in how we approached it. We really thought that like the people doing the actions that we were concerned about didn't realize what they were doing, didn't realize the impact they were having on this person. And we really foolishly believed in their ability to sort of learn and grow and like want to get better if we brought this to our attention or to their attention. So we were kind of like a little bit too compassionate in our approach. You know, we didn't name specific individuals or specific actions. We just said, hey, you know, this is an issue, this person deserves more support. And just also some extra stuff to kind of like counteract the discrimination this person was experiencing, to just like communicate a collective perception of the person that was more accurate than the racist sort of tropes that were being relied upon in the treatment of this person. And what, instead of a positive response of like, oh, you know, we need to reevaluate and do better, what these people actually did is double down, and their treatment of that student got much worse. So great, we did the right thing, but what did we accomplish? You know, we literally made that person's life worse. So it's very, very hard. You know, I wouldn't say, you know, don't speak up, but you know, I like that. I don't think is the answer either, but you know, and in addition to doing the right thing, you know, you have to consider the environment that you're doing that right thing in. Is it an environment that's going to support you doing the right thing? You know, what is going to be the potential cost to the person that you're trying to advocate for? You know, these issues are very complicated. So,
Wow. Well, Savannah,
Thank
first of
you.
all, great question. And Rachel, thank you as well for sharing. So it's probably been about 15 minutes, and I usually just like to allow about 15 minutes for questions. So unless I see any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. We appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this evening. If you have any additional questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Purtell. Dr. Purtell's email is repurtell@gmail.com. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us. Have a good night, everyone. And Dr. Purtell, thank you so very much again for sharing your knowledge, expertise, and wisdom.
yeah,
Everyone,
thank you very much for having me and for holding this series. And thank you everyone very much for coming and for your time today.
everyone have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Bye.